Welcome to Her Story, the history of Southeast Asia told from her perspective. We'll discover historical figures, matriarchal societies, and contemporary female icons, and maybe learn about ourselves along the way. I'm your host, Agus Ramirez. In the next couple of episodes, we're revisiting the Minangkabau Matrilineal Society, specifically through Ruhana Kuddus, Indonesia's first female journalist, and Soenting Melajoe, the pioneering indigenous women's newspaper published from 1912 to 1921 in the Minangkabau community in West Sumatra. Research and writing for this episode was done in collaboration with Joanna Que, with additional research by AJ Miras-Guevarra. The year is 1912. Ruhana Kuddus, an early women's education activist, launches a trailblazing newspaper with a bold mission to uplift and empower women in the Minangkabau community. It's called Soenting Melajoe, Surat Kabar Perempuan di Alam Minangkabau, literally, Newspaper for Women in the Minangkabau Land. The Minangkabau, if you're not familiar, is the largest matrilineal society in the world. In a matrilineal society, a person's descent is traced to their mother or their maternal ancestors. Ancestral property, such as land, is handed down from mother to daughter. Note, however, that this ownership isn't absolute. Men are considered of equal importance in the society, and there is a balance here. So the woman's male kin, known as mama or maternal uncle, would still have the right to manage the property and make a decision, especially when the family wants to sell it. This generally isn't done unless in an emergency specified by cultural norms called adat. An example of an emergency is to cover the cost of a burial or to pay for a wedding. So to be clear, they are equally acknowledged, but it's not the woman's husband, it's her male relatives who have power over ancestral property. Although the Minangkabau today are citizens of the Republic of Indonesia, they have often been depicted as a unique ethnic group, sharing a language, a subculture, a religion, a homeland, and a special position within the Indonesian economy. You can go back to episode 7 of this podcast for a full discussion on the Minangkabau, which features an interview with Haldi Patra. One thing that we need to highlight here before we go on is that even though Minangkabau was a matrilineal society, the public role of women, especially in decision making, was limited. That seems counterintuitive, right? If their status was so high, why weren't they seen? The short answer is what I already mentioned: balance. Drawing on the work of Yusmarin Jalius, we know that women's high and respected position was represented by the central ideal and mythical figure of Bundo Kanduang, the true mother. Bundo Kanduang is described in Minangkabau oral literature as a queen born alongside the creation of the universe. She is elegant, wise, enigmatic, and the source of knowledge, wisdom, and truth. She successfully educated her son, who later became the great king of Minangkabau. To quote oral tradition, Bundo Kanduang, limpape rumahagadang, umbun puro. Bundo Kanduang, the ornament and joy of the house, the holder of the ancestral treasure. While she is alive, the one to pay respect to. When she died, the place to pray. However, and this is important, Bundo Kanduang was not the decision maker. Decisions couldn't be made without her consent for sure, but publicly, decisions were made by the king of the world, Raja Alam Minangkabau, assisted by two other kings. This is the rub. In the equilibrium set by Minangkabau society, in the matters of her own lineage or sublineage, the authority of the senior woman is higher even than that of the chief of the clan, but her male relatives are the ones who speak publicly. In short, to quote Jalius, like Bundo Kanduang in the traditional Adat concept, women are believed to have potential, but men are needed to realize it. And so time wore on, and we arrived at the colonial period. Now, the impact of colonialism and the influx of Western ideas is a whole other episode entirely. But we need to note that it did affect how the Minangkabau saw themselves and their society. They have always been flexible. The idea of adaptability was built into the culture, but they saw how scientific ideas gave Western society an edge. The word was kemajuan, progress and modernity. Remember that one. Women realized the peculiarity of their situation, and actually both women and men figured out that kemajuan would go much faster if everyone were involved. A prominent male figure at this time was Datu Usutan Maharaja, who built the first school for girls in 1907. At the time, some women had already entered the Dutch Creek School or Sekolah Raja, and as with education, they began to seek ways to become more active in public life. This is where women like Ruhana Kuddus, Rahma El Yunusia, and Rasuna Said come in. Today, we'll be focusing on Ruhana Kuddus, an early women's education activist and founder of the first women's newspaper published in the Minangkabau region, also known as Soenting Melajoe. Ruhana Kuddus was born in Kota Gadang, West Sumatra, in December of 1884. Later, her family moved to Alahan Panjang for her father's job as a civil servant in the Dutch colonial government. Growing up, she didn't receive formal primary education, but she learned through Adyesa, a civil servant's wife who had no children of her own. Ruhana became fluent in reading and writing the Arabic, Jawi, and Latin alphabets by the age of 8. As a child, she taught other children to read and write as well, igniting a passion to educate that intensified as she got older. After her mother's death in 1897, she moved back to Kota Gadang and started teaching young girls handicraft and how to read the Quran. Later, in 1911, when she was around 27 years old, Ruhana Kuddus founded Kerajinan Amay Setya, which translates to the Industry of Faithful Mothers. We'll refer to it as KAS for short, as it gets mentioned a lot here. KAS was an educational institution for women in Ruhana's hometown. It's called Kota Gadang, and it's a tiny village in the west of Sumatra near Bukit Tinggi City. It's known for its community of silversmiths. KAS taught the women about reading and writing, mathematics, household management, religion, handicrafts, sewing and embroidery, among other things. As the years passed, KAS became an institution for skill sharing, which also developed into a trading business where products were marketed and sold to benefit the women. It was Minangkabau's first women's economic enterprise. In 1916, Ruhana moved to Bukit Tinggi where she founded the Ruhana School for Girls. She earned the title Forerunner in Women's Education in Sumatra for her role in the spread of education. But her advocacy was just one side of her. Apart from the creation of KAS, Ruhana was a journalist, in fact, a trailblazer in women's mass media. Her career in journalism started with Poetry Hindia, the first women's newspaper in Batavia, which is now Jakarta. Unfortunately, Poetry Hindia got banned by the colonial government. She wasn't ready to give up writing just yet, though. She sent a letter to Datu Sultan Maharaja, then editor-in-chief of another newspaper, Utusan Melayu, asking for space for women's thoughts. Datu Sultan Maharaja visited her in Kota Gadang, and their conversations led to her establishing Soenting Melajoe, the Minang women's newspaper, which had a good long run from 1912 to 1921. Around 1913, she talked about KAS in one of her articles called Perempuan Hindia, which voiced women's struggles. For context, many parents believed that women didn't need to be educated as they would only work in the home. In summary, she said, "We, the women of the Indies, have risen to try to achieve what is important and obligatory for us women to look after the household and other endeavors, to work on the path for the future. We hold a company where women are learning skills with their hands, running a household, and learning various skills. We call this group Kerajinan Amay Setya." In 1920, she left Soenting Melajoe and management of the newspaper passed to Retna Tunun. That same year, she moved to Medan and became the editor-in-chief of the Perempuan Bergerak newspaper, along with Satiman Parada Harahap. Perempuan Bergerak literally translates to Women on the Move. Just a side note on the development of the Indonesian press here, and that's why I mentioned Satiman Parada Harahap. From the mid-1920s onward, journalism in Indonesia experienced a fundamental change as it became more of a capitalist venture. According to Dielman, Koning, and Post, in the book Chinese Indonesians and Regime Change, quote, "This development reflected the growth of an urban middle class that was politically conservative and more concerned with maintaining their living standards. Commercial newspapers covered general developments of indigenous political movements, but the emphasis was rather to introduce articles on culture, religion, education, and women's emancipation, among others, in order to meet a growing demand from readers. Journalistic writing styles, such as the travel accounts by Parada Harahap, became popular among urban middle-class readers. Unlike the indigenous press of the 1910s and early 1920s, which had played a major role in confronting the colonial authorities, the newspaper business under Parahadaharahap conformed to the colonial order, and in fact took a collaborative approach in relation to authority. This approach became the trend in the expansion of the Malay print market from the 1920s onward. Unquote. Back to Ruhana's writing. Throughout her career, Ruhana aimed to spread the message of women's liberation. She wanted to empower them by promoting education, fighting against cultural marginalization, and addressing various injustices. Like Radina Kartini, Ruhana criticized underage marriage, forced marriage, polygamy, and talak, or the Arabic word for divorce. Here, it specifically means the unilateral right of the man to divorce his wife, which doesn't require her consent. The ex-wife must then observe a waiting period of approximately 3 months to be sure that she's not pregnant. Then she's free to remarry. These women writers clearly saw these cultural norms as unfair to women. For more on Radina Kartini, go back to episode 5 where we talked to Priscilla Bertha about Radina Kartini's legacy. Some of Ruhana's other popular articles published from 1913 to 1920 include Faithful to the Women's Movement of Today, Today's Women's Equality Movement, Women, and Looking for a Wife. Unsurprisingly, the feminist movement, of which Ruhana Kuddus was certainly a prominent figure, wasn't always welcomed. These were, after all, thoughts and feelings that went against an established norm. On December 27, 1932, Ruhana was imprisoned due to her writing. She was accused of violating the Spreek Delict Act, or speaking in offense. And she wasn't the only one. Rasuna Said was also arrested and imprisoned for 15 months due to her writings in Raya newspapers and heroic discussions in the organization of Persatuan Muslim in Indonesia. 2 members of the editorial board of Medan Poetry, Jalina Jamil and Mawimuna Ismail, were also imprisoned for allegedly violating the Spreek Delict Act. I couldn't find exactly how long Ruhana was in prison for, so if anyone knows, let me know. Side note, I always wonder how many of us would be in prison if we were born in another decade. Some of us might have been burnt at the stake by now, actually. Cheers! After a long career doing everything that pretty much nobody expected women at the time to do, Ruhana Kuddus passed away in Jakarta on August 17, 1972, at 87 years old. It was Indonesia's 27th Independence Day. She was buried in Karet Biwak Cemetery, which is the second largest cemetery in Jakarta. In 1974, 2 years after she passed, Ruhana was honored as the first female journalist in Minangkabau to advocate for women. In 2019, the Indonesian government hailed Ruhana Kuddus as an Indonesian national hero for her contributions as the editor of Soenting Melajoe. She was only the 4th journalist and the first ever female journalist to be awarded such recognition. That's why many refer to her as Indonesia's first female journalist. Ruhana Kuddus was a pioneer in all aspects of the word. She believed that education was crucial in empowering women and changing their destinies. Her legacy is evident in the Kas School, the Soenting Melajoe newspaper, and Ruhana School, which played significant roles in advancing women's education and empowerment. Ruhana understood the power of mass media in educating communities, and she used her writing to advocate for women's education and liberation. The support and hard work of the people around her, women and men alike, contributed greatly to how far she was able to take her advocacy. Her story lives on in all of us today who continue to share our thoughts on women's rights and gender equality. In the next episode, we'll delve more deeply into the Soenting Melajoe newspaper, its editors and contributors, and its impact on the women's rights movement. Thank you for listening to episode 25, Ruhana Kuddus, Indonesia's first female journalist. Thank you to our patrons, Drainion, Lawrence, Beverly, Xiaomi Bemilish, Jennifer, Christina, Raymond, Matt, Ashley, Chanda, and Yati. For more Her Story Southeast Asia, head on over to Patreon for the bonus episodes. An interview with Haldi Patra on the Minangkabau Matriarchal Society, Maying Taphan and the Krom Clone, Nyai Gede Pinateh, the Harbour Master of Gresik, Queen Suriyothai and the War Elephants, Past Marquez Benitez and Dead Stars, The Rise and Fall of the Acehnese Queens, 1641 to 1699, The Portrait of Dara Rasami, The Women of Number 14 Lebuh Leith, and the upcoming episode on Burmese journalists Ludu Amar and Mama Le. Along with the bonus episodes, you get access to full scripts and reference materials. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Threads, and Instagram at Her Story CPod. That's Her Story, SEA Pod. This podcast was hosted and edited by Agas Ramirez. Maraming salamat.